You won't walk away.
Is that recording?
I'm going to bring you some more chairs.
Try not to bonk anybody. There you go.
Well, thank you.
I guess they'll have to invest in more chairs.
Okay, we're out of chairs and we're out of parking places, so we got to start here. Yeah. The next program will be 2 weeks from today, and it's going to be Cindy Drake from Nebraska State Historical Society. She was doing other research and kind of accidentally found out that the first winery in Nebraska was in Cass County. So she told us a little bit about that at our annual meeting, and she's going to expand on that for the program 2 weeks from today. And today we have Suzanne Astley, Sandra Young-Algeier, Pat Meisinger, Legene Coinson, and Jeannie Young-Brookhauser, who are going to talk about some people who are buried at Young Cemetery. And I think you all know that Jeannie and Sandra descend from the owners of Young Cemetery. So.
Okay, thank you. Gee, it's great to see such a nice group here today. So Ghosts of a Pioneer Cemetery is what we're going to be talking about. In the year 2011, the Plattsmouth Conservancy sponsored an event at our cemetery, and we presented that program 6 times over 2 days with actors from the Conservancy and 2 paraprofessionals from Omaha. They were all in costume provided by the Plattsmouth Conservancy costume shop, just as we are costumed here today in our Victorian funeral garb. They played the parts of some of the people buried there. So as we go through the pictures, you might see some of them as their roles during that program. The Pioneer Cemetery, according to the state of Nebraska, had to be established before 1900, has notable characters buried there. They might be settlers or homesteaders or community founders and leaders, or Civil War veterans or Native Americans. Let me back up. So today we're going to talk about Young Cemetery, which is just south of Plattsmouth, right near quarter-mile east of Highway 75. And we're also going to talk about Victorian-era funeral customs and about the ghosts that are buried at Young Cemetery. But first, during the Victorian era, the tombstones often had symbolic images. Those images on the tombstones were chosen by the family to express the sorrow in an individual way and to help beautify those stones. So here are a few examples that are in Young Cemetery. This one shows oak leaves. They depict strength and stability, and that was usually the father of the family. The ivy leaves on the other side of this tombstone represent immortality, friendship, and fidelity, and that's usually the mother of the family. Very difficult to see, but this is a finger pointing upward, and that means the soul has gone to heaven. If you look there, you'll see that this is a broken column, and that means a life has been cut short. So you're going to hear about a couple lives that were cut very short during this program today. This is the Masonic symbol, and it shows Mason's tools with a G in the middle, and they think that either stands for God or geometry, which would have to do with Mason skills. This first one, that says Young on it, is a natural rock, and that would be our great-grandfathers and the son of the founder. The second one is a draped stone, and that represents the mourning veil. And the third one is a closed book, and of course that represents this life is over in this earthly life. An obelisk is the connection between heaven and earth. The fern, as seen at the top of this one, represents sincerity. And the tree of life in the last one is victory over death. an open book, which you can just barely see here. That would be a Bible, or either a Sunday school teacher or a regular teacher, or just a person who was very wise. The handshake represents a goodbye or the unity of marriage. And the weeping willow in this one represents the sadness of the death. Angels, doves, and lambs are often the children.
Well, before we begin talking about the people who are buried in the Young Pioneer Cemetery, I'd like to ask you to step back in time with me. And I'm going to give you a little perspective regarding the funeral and mourning customs that would have dictated the behavior of the family and the mourners after the death of a loved one in the 1800s. Curtains would be drawn and clocks would be stopped at the time of death. Mirrors were covered with crepe or veiling to prevent the deceased spirit from getting trapped in the looking glass. A wreath of laurel tied with crepe or black ribbons was hung on the front door to alert passersby that a death had occurred. The body was watched over for every minute until burial, hence the custom of waking. The wake also served as a safeguard from burying somebody who was not dead, but in a coma. In fact, the fear of a loved one being buried alive inspired coffin makers to design safety coffins, such as those with a bell on the grave, which was connected to a chain inside of the coffin, to be used in the cases of premature burial. Thus the expression came, saved by the bell. Most wakes lasted 3 or 4 days to allow relatives to arrive from far away. The use of flowers and candles helped to mask unpleasant odors in the room before embalming became commonplace. The dead were always carried out of the house, feet first, to prevent the spirit from looking back into the house and beckoning other members of the family to follow him. Family photos were turned upside down to prevent any of the close relatives or friends of the deceased from being possessed by the spirit of the dead. Social decorum demanded that family members adjust their behavior and dress for years after the death of a close relative. Clothing was an intricate part of the mourning process, and the strictest of rules involved matters of fashion. The most important ingredient in Victorian mourning was the color black. The closer one was to deceased, the more black one wore, and the longer one wore it. In general, the widow was the one hardest hit by the customs of the day. She was expected to remain in mourning for up to 2 years. Deep mourning was to last a year and a day, and she was not only expected to dress entirely in black, but also to limit her social activities to only church attendance. In fact, her social life was so restricted that she may not even attend the memorial service or burial of her own husband. Women were required to wear a weeping veil. It served to shield the tears of the mourner from the eyes of others. But another of the superstitions they believed in was that the spirit of the departed would hover around those they loved. If a passerby looked directly into a mourner's face, that spirit might attach itself to that person. So the veil was a protection for the wearer as well as a protection for others. Our ancestors believed in many superstitions, and there are a multitude of superstitions surrounding death. Perhaps that was because death was something that could not be fully comprehended. The following are just a sampling of some of the Victorian death superstitions. If the deceased has lived a good life, flowers will bloom on their grave. But if he has been evil, only weeds will grow. If several deaths occur in the same family, tie a black ribbon around everything left alive that enters the house, even dogs and chickens. This will protect against death spreading further. If you hear a clap of thunder following a burial, it indicates that the soul of the departed has reached heaven. If you hear 3 knocks and no one is there, it usually means that someone close to you has died. The superstitious call this the 3 knocks of death. If you smell roses when none are around, someone is going to die. If a picture falls off the wall, there will be a death of someone you know. You must also always close the eyes of the deceased so that he may not choose someone to accompany him to his grave. If you spill salt, throw a pinch of the spilled salt over your shoulder to prevent death. As you can see, that was a very different time.
The Young Cemetery had its first burial in 1855. You're going to hear more about that later. In those early days of Cass County, as the need for the community cemetery grew, other settlers were permitted to use this site as well. William Young donated 1/2 acre, and later the school district added another 1/2 acre, creating the current 1 acre site. When the Young Cemetery Association was organized in 1888, the entire acre was deeded to the association. Lots of 9 plots each had been sold for $5. That's $5 for 9 lots, starting in that era. And people are still being buried at this cemetery today as a result of those purchases. Thus, while there are many young family members buried here, it also has served as a community cemetery. Clara Young White was the youngest of the 7 children of David and Anna Mann Young, and the granddaughter of William and Rebecca, who was born in 1893. Born 6 years after the rest of her siblings and the baby of the family, she said she could remember as a young girl walking hand in hand with her father David in knee-high grass at the cemetery as her father worried about what was going to become of the cemetery. At that time, about 50 years after its beginning, it was already evident that Decoration Day, now Memorial Day, when relatives and neighbors would decorate the graves of the cemetery, was not the event that it once had been. As Clara grew up, she said she felt a duty to do what she could to make sure that her father's fears of family and friends resting in an overgrown and forgotten setting did not become a reality. Therefore, she began writing letters to relatives near and far, seeking monetary support to keep the cemetery alive. In addition, in later years, she enlisted the help of her brother, 11 years her senior. Albert was the second son of David and Anna. She needed help in providing a shelter for mourners out of the cold of winter and the heat of the summer. At that time, in 1940, close to 100 years from the first burial, there were already 223 graves in the cemetery. Clara's idea was to move the 1850s cabin of her grandparents, William and Rebecca, from its original location in the Rock Bluff area up to the cemetery. She contacted the National Youth Administration Office for assistance, and in 1941, Albert, with the help of 7 local NYA youth, began the work of disassembling the young cabin and moving it to the present location on a concrete slab. The boys were paid 25 cents an hour, and just in time for Decoration Day on May 25th, they had completed their work. At the ceremony, the Murray Presbyterian minister gave the invocation and honored the servicemen that were buried there. a representative of the NYA spoke, dedicating the cabin to the pioneers of Nebraska. The only furnishings in the cabin, a rocking chair, a table, a Bible, and a guest book. If any of you ever visited the cemetery many years ago, you would have signed your name in the guest pages, which were kept in a glass jar to keep the squirrels and mice from eating them. We still have most of those pages with our cemetery information, and they contain our signatures as when we were children. Because of the work of the NYA and the time of the records that were kept, the Young cabin was placed on the National Historical Registry in 2004. Clara Young White married and had 2 daughters and lived in Plattsmouth for a while before later moving to Colorado, passing away in 1973 after serving many years as a nurse aide. She's buried next to her husband, Guy White, at the Young Cemetery near her parents and her siblings in the Young family plot. Albert was a carpenter most of his life. He lost his wife in 1936 and remained a widower with no children. After living in South Dakota and Colorado, he longed to be back in his home, Nebraska. In 1965, he passed away here in Plattsmouth at the age of 83, but he's buried at Lewiston Cemetery with his wife, Pauline. We don't have any actual photos of Clara and Albert, but the reenactors from our Pioneer Cemetery walk were a very close resemblance to both of them.
The first burial in what would become the Young Cemetery was the infant son of William and Rebecca Young in 1855. William Young was born in Kentucky in 1808, married and moved to Missouri. His first wife died, leaving 4 young children. William then married his cousin, Rebecca McBroom, and the family moved to Mills County, Iowa, where 2 more children were born. In 1854, when the Nebraska Territory opened up for settlement, William had crossed the river and claimed land in what would become the Rock Bluffs area. The next year in March, the family crossed the Missouri River at Kenosha, and with the help of their Iowa neighbors, moved to their cabin 6 miles north. There was no house yet, so the family unloaded their belongings in the woods and stretched a tent. The family of 7, with Rebecca expecting her 3rd child, briefly lived in a tent until they could cut logs and build a 1-room cabin. A shingle rive used by William when he built his cabin was donated to the Nebraska Historical Society by his son David in 1918. Their son, Joseph Henry, was born in August but sadly died in December. The bereaved parents chose a high spot on their land to bury their baby. The next year, logs were cut and hewn for a double log house with a double fireplace. This was the first hewn log house in the neighborhood. The second room was later used as a school for the community for several years. William's son, Francis, wrote his remembrances of those early days. He recalled driving the cattle and sheep across the prairie to their claim when they first arrived in Nebraska Territory. He wrote that about 500 Indians briefly camped about a half-mile south of the family when they first settled, but there was only one incident. The Indian's dog killed a neighbor's, Mr. Clements, hog. So Mr. Clements shot the dog. They were even and trouble was averted. Like many early settlers, they were bothered by claim jumpers and formed a claim club to settle disputes and protect the original settler. Francis wrote that one night, troublemakers were escorted over the river and never seen again. It was generally supposed that they were heavily weighted and never saw the other side. I have found accounts of the same story involving claim jumpers in other counties, so I suspect there is some validity in the tale. In 1865, 10 years after they settled on their claim, Rebecca died, leaving several young children motherless. In his time, William was very involved in the communities where he lived. He was Justice of the Peace, County Surveyor, County Commissioner, road commissioner, and was given credit for organizing the first county fair. His long life spanned nearly 3 centuries, from 1808 to 1899.
Potter's Field. Many cemeteries have a Potter's Field, even small graveyards, such as the 1-acre Young Cemetery we consider here today. A few decades after the first burial, the Youngs were approached with a request by the Hesser family. The Hessers had what they characterized as a weak-minded individual working for them. He went by the name of Tom Nixon. He was so slight, only about 5 feet tall and 135 pounds. And in their words, rather peculiar. They thought him harmless, never bothered anyone, just peculiar. When he died at their home, they could not locate any relative, and they just didn't think it was right to bury him out in the field. So they got permission to establish a little Potter's Field in the Young Cemetery. And for that, they were very grateful. Tom, or whoever he rightly was, rested in lot number 18, where the cabin is now, from 1891 until 1940. When Albert planned to move the cabin, a permit was carefully secured from the state to move the body. Tom now lays comfortably in lot number 16 in an unmarked grave, but has never been joined by any others. While there are no other Potter's Field residents, if you today walk around the cemetery, you will notice many tombstones with only a few words on them, not enough to determine to whom they belonged or when they died. Despite the careful record keeping of the past almost 17 decades, we cannot tell you their names nor their stories. We can't help but think many of them were babies, buried in both haste and sorrow, the parents thinking they would never forget them.
Young Cemetery is a final resting place for 7 Civil War veterans. They came from 5 states and represent the variety of settlers that settled in Cass County after the Civil War. Hospital steward Samuel Latta and Corporal Lewis Young were living in Cass County when they joined the military, and both served in the West, protecting settlers in the Nebraska Territory from Indian uprisings. Military historians include these soldiers who fought in the West in their list of Civil War veterans. Private Vincent Kennedy was living in Iowa when he enlisted. He was discharged from the Iowa Regiment for Disability in 1863, but the next year joined the Colorado Cavalry Unit. This unit was involved in the massacre at Sand Creek in November of 1894. On that date, 700 members of the Colorado militia attacked and destroyed a village of friendly Native Americans in southeastern Colorado, sadly killing up to 200 or more. This is now a historic site and administered by the National Park Service. Brothers John Holmes and Thomas Holmes were New York residents when they enlisted and are buried in the same lot at Young Cemetery. Although both served in the 101st New York Infantry, it's not clear if they served at the same time. They and at least one other brother moved to Cass County following the end of the war. Private John Lindsay from Wisconsin was involved in several major battles and events. This included the Siege of Atlanta, William Sherman's March to the Sea, and the surrender of the Army of Tennessee. Private Jasper Totten lived in Indiana and enlisted when he was 35 years old. His unit was also involved in several historic battles and events, including the Battle of Chickamauga, the Siege of Atlanta, and the pursuit of Confederate President Jefferson Davis in May of 1865. 4 of the men were members of the Plattsmouth Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. This organization reached a peak in 1882 in Plattsmouth with 86 veterans on its roll. I noticed an interesting fact regarding the age of these 7 men. 2 were in their mid and late 20s when they enlisted, and the remaining 5 were over 30. And although all of the veterans would have experienced life-threatening battles, they had long lives for the time. The 7 lived from age 64 to 93, 2 in their 90s. Other veterans buried at Young Cemetery are World War I, Charles Kennedy; World War II, Francis Cooksey, Ed Kroll, Dale Long, and Lyle Lawton. The Korean conflict, Kenneth Lyons. Vietnam era, Edwin Trively and Jean DeSharon. Twin brothers, John and Jim Furlong, who attended Rock Bluff School, are buried here. John served in the Army and Jim in the Navy, both in the early 1960s.
Lucelia Young. Lucelia Young was her name, but she was also called Daisy, and she was called Lucy, and Lucy's what we will call her today. I am unable to tell you of a long, hard, but fulfilling life as you have heard about others, for that was not to be Lucy's destiny. Lucy was born in 1880, just 25 years after her grandparents William and Rebecca came across the Missouri to settle in Rock Bluff. She was the 3rd of 7 children of David Young and his wife Anna, but she did not meet all her siblings. Imagine their busy but secure life on the farm. Children, chores, crops, and animals, with the older children looking after the younger ones. Responsibility came early, and everyone knew their roles. We know the beginning of the day Lucy died from family tradition and oral history. We know the end of that day from newspaper accounts. The Youngs had a new pony, and Lucy wanted to ride that new pony to town. Early in the day, she asked her father to saddle up the pony, but he refused. It's not clear why. Was it because the pony was too new and the family was uncomfortable allowing her to solo ride? Ponies can be trouble. But Lucy was a farm girl, familiar with the ways of animals. Was it because there was just too much work to be done that summer day, that day like any other summer day? While we don't know why her father refused, we do know Lucy persuaded her brother to lift that heavy tack to ready the pony for her ride. Not the oldest brother, Dallas, who's Jeannie and Sanders' grandfather and 3 years her senior. No, it was Albert, one of her little brothers. A couple of years younger, and off she went to Murray, a ride of just a few miles. What she did in Murray is also not certain, but at the time there was a lumber yard and a blacksmith and livery barn. There was also John Edmonds' mercantile business and post office, where Lucy could have picked up the mail and supplies on her parents' account. Lucy then headed home, and then something happened. It happened as she approached Rock Creek Christian Church, not far from town. Tradition tells us perhaps her paper bags rustled, and the animal spooked and began running. Lucy, we are told, was wearing a new bonnet and may have shifted her weight to hold it tight. Unbalanced, Lucy fell from the pony. Not normally a terrible event for a farm girl, familiar with animals and their ways, but her one small foot remained in the stirrup. Lucy was dragged and kicked by her beloved pony. She was only freed when the stirrup broke. Found and cared for kindly by country neighbors, where Lucy had been almost home. She succumbed to her injuries and passed into eternal rest at 5:15 on July 18th, 1893. At age 13, she became the 74th burial in Young Cemetery. Less than 2 months later, her sister Clara, the seventh sibling, and the one that Lucy would not meet in this life, was born.
Well, buried in the cemetery is a first responder who lost his life in the line of duty. The date is March 26, 1914, and the place is Sioux City, Iowa. Fire has broken out in a 5-story building occupied by the Anderson Furniture Company. The wood in the building burst savagely into flames. The fire is now consuming a quarter block in the heart of the business district. Guests at the Frank Hotel are warned and most escape down the stairwell. 3 men in the hotel are cut off by the flames and are forced to leave for their lives, as are several men and women in adjacent buildings. Caught by the nets of the firemen, they escape unharmed. Meanwhile, Celie Lawton, age 27, driver for the fire chief Kellogg, and a fireman himself, is part of a group heroically battling the blaze. A brick wall collapses in response to an explosion behind it, pinning Celie and another fireman under the rubble. Amidst all the bravery and dramatic rescues, it's 2 hours before they are missed by their comrades. Finally, their remains are discovered, along with a heavy truck, appearing to have died instantly when they are crushed by the tumbling wall. Celie was brought back to his beloved Nebraska and laid to rest with his wife, Ona Young's family. Ona, daughter of David Young, never remarried and was buried nearby in 1945, resting in the same cemetery as her siblings Clara and Lucy. The Lawtons' only child, Lyle, a tender age of 3 when his father died violent and sudden death, went on to become a lawyer and a major in World War II. With Lyle losing his father at a very young age, and his mother when he was still a young man, another young sibling, Rex, Ona's brother, became a father figure to Lyle. Lyle and his wife now both sleep peacefully with his parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents in Young Cemetery.
So we've heard about Rex. I'm going to tell you a little more about Rex Young now. Several of you may have been familiar with him if you're from this area. He was quite a character. He was an auctioneer for 65 years, and those who knew him can attest that he probably knew every face in the county at that time and some from the surrounding countryside. He was born William Rex Young, but a lot of people called him Colonel, as they did all auctioneers. He was the 6th of 7 children of David and Anna Mann Young, born in 1887 in a 2-room log house, as he described, just a hollering distance from what's now Beaver Lake. He lived just a couple of weeks short of his 94th birthday, and in our Pioneer Walk that we did about in 2011, Rex was portrayed by Doug Dewey. Rex went to Rock Creek School as a child, which was on what is now probably the westernmost part of the north shore of Beaver Lake. At one time, his sister, Lena, was his teacher. In an interview, he recalled that the boys in the school would get a little unruly at times, and it was decided that a male teacher was probably what those boys needed. So they hired one, and the first day that he came in, he had a big club laying across his desk. He had said he was pretty sure he could take on those boys one at a time, but if he ever had to take on more than that, that's what the club was going to be for. So according to Rex, he had the best school there ever was, and the teacher never did have to use that club. And then a little later, we're going to show you a map, what we believe was probably Rex's walk from his home place close to the cemetery down to where Rock Creek School was on the shore of Beaver Lake. So his first official job was a rural mail carrier in 1908. He had a 24-mile route with a wagon pulled by 2 mules. He worked on the railroad, he farmed, he was a deputy sheriff in addition to being an auctioneer since 1911. He stayed in the Murray and the Plattsmouth area all of his life, said he was never one to bum off. Besides, he liked the land and the people here. As a majority of those that are buried in Young Cemetery, he lived through some pretty hard times. In the Depression, he said he sold corn for 8 cents a bushel, hogs for 8 cents a pound, and he was mighty glad to do it. Uncle Rex was always selling something, it seemed. As he used to say, sometimes the cattle he sold had grass growing on their backs because the wind had carried the seeds in the soil that landed on their backs. Always something extra for the customer, he said. He traveled a little bit as a young man. He even helped build a telephone line to Teddy Roosevelt's ranch in South Dakota. In the 20s and 30s, when he was a deputy sheriff, he was shot taking a prisoner from aboard a train in Plattsmouth, but he went on to live for 50 additional years, and he moved to Plattsmouth in 1920. He was probably best known for being an auctioneer throughout the state of Nebraska. After 40 years of auctioneering, he called a sale at the Omaha Stockyards in 1951, which brought in $1.2 million. It lasted for 7.5 hours with no lunch break, and that sale was for 4,000 head of cattle, most of them going through as singles. He celebrated 50 years of auctioneering with about 1,800 guests at an event in 1961 in Murdock, Nebraska. On the program was Leroy Van Dyke, a singer that was made famous by his song simply entitled The Auctioneer. He was the president of the Nebraska Auctioneers Association and a member of their Hall of Fame, as well as being named to the National Hall of Fame of Auctioneers in 1971. In 1976, he retired from calling auctions after 65 years and was the oldest active auctioneer in America, and also had the added distinction of having accumulated the largest total sales in the United States and Canada. He cried more than 12,000 auctions. Some of you may remember him from the auctions he called at the sale barn on the south side of town here. Rex donated the land for the Murray Park in Murray that is now called Young Park, as well as the acre of land on which the Murray Christian Church was built. He was honored by then-Governor Norbert Tiemann as an admiral of the Great Navy of the state of Nebraska. He was king of the Cass County King Corn Carnival in 1964, as well as being the announcer for that event for many years. Rex was married twice. The first marriage in 1909 was to Winnie Rice. It got off to a bad start. Their new home, furnishings and all, caught fire on the very night of their wedding and was badly damaged. It was believed to have been arson. As noted in the local paper, if it was set afire and the perpetrator of that dastardly deed can be found, he deserves the severest punishment that the law can give him. That marriage did not last. But in 1914, he married Pearl Hinton, who died in 1967 and is buried next to Rex. Her gravestone says it all, good wife, while his simply says auctioneer. Rex had no children to bless either marriage, but he did have a nephew that we've learned of, Lyle Lawton, his sister Ona's son, whom he helped raise after Lyle's father was tragically killed. In an interview in 1974, Rex talked about the Beaver Lake area. He said some of the land under which the Beaver Lake is now built belonged to his wife's family, the Hintons. He said in his opinion they should have named it Arrowhead Lake because as a child he said you couldn't turn over a piece of soil without finding arrowheads in that area. While he looked over the Beaver Lake area just beginning to fill with water, he looked to where the clubhouse now stands, and he points to where they used to have maypole dances when he was about 16. They'd put up a pole about as high as a telephone pole and have a dance near a big brick house that sat there. He also added that during the construction of Beaver Lake, they had to cover up the foundation of an old still. Everyone knew it was there. He could remember his father talking about it when he was a little boy. He said that there used to be a lot more trees on the land where Beaver Lake is now. He cleared a lot of them himself, as well as pulling up the stumps. He would cut wood for $2 a cord with a handsaw, and it took him pretty nearly a whole day to cut a cord. Rex passed away on August 8th in 1981, and he is buried near his siblings that are resting in the family plot at the Young Cemetery.
The Young Cemetery, with 288 burials, is a member of the East Cass Pioneer Cemetery District. This is a taxing entity designed to help financially with 17 cemeteries in the area with their maintenance costs. It is sanctioned by the state of Nebraska to help save these pioneer cemeteries. In our 25 years of managing the Young Cemetery, we have suffered some very expensive wind damage. This was just this year. We have suffered vandalism. There we had to call the sheriff out, and they, of course, never found who did that. There they kicked the door in and broke all the glass out, just left things, and broke all the furniture inside the cabin. We have tombstone repair and keeping that maintenance on the cabin. We have had little Boy Scouts help with us, and Eagle Scout candidate built this flagpole and surround, and they laid a path to the cabin. And most recently, an Eagle Scout candidate installed this fence across the front. The first burial was an infant, Joseph Young. Our last burial was Jim Furlong. Jim helped with the tour by playing mournful tunes on the harmonica while leading the tour groups through the cemetery. Jim's grandparents, parents, and his twin brother are buried at Young Cemetery. Like David and Clara, Jeannie and I have often wondered who's going to take care of this cemetery when we're gone. Well, our cousin Lyle Lawton will be the next in charge, and he, with the help of East Cass Pioneer Cemetery District, will see that this cemetery does not become abandoned and forgotten. There are a few William Young's descendants left in the area. That would be Jeannie and her children and grandchildren, Stacy's to Sharon, her children and grandchildren, Lyle Lawton and his children and grandchildren, me, my child and grandchild. None of these carry the name Young, except Jeannie's son Michael has the middle name of Young. So you're welcome to visit the cemetery at any time, and you might see there the marker for my husband and I, because if the marker is there, and that's where we will be buried. This sign was made for the tour of 2011, and it was put over the mantle in the cabin for that occasion. It's a list of all the burials in Young Cemetery. So feel free to read the names, because that sign is back there. I brought it here. So you can stop and read the names. For it is said that we die 3 times. The day we stop breathing, the day we are buried, and the day that our name is last spoken. So, thank you for coming today. Do you have any questions about what we did? Yes.
Sandra, do you have any idea how many plots are left?
A few. Several years ago, I read in the Nebraska cemetery law that if a plot that was bought over 50 years ago and never tended or never any action on that lot, you can advertise in the paper that it can be resold. So I am selling now a few of those lots. I probably maybe 10 or 12 left.
How much?
They are $250 per burial.
Okay, very good.
Okay, any other questions?
That's very good.
Feel free to, as I said, there's a book, the maps that Jeannie referred to about where the schoolhouse was and where the Young Cemetery plot was. And as I said, all of the burials are listed there. And the book that we made after the tour that we did in 2011 is all back there. So feel free to browse.
There's also a little newsletter that went out, I think it was called the Beaver News or Beaver Briefs back in the 70s when they were first building Beaver Lake. And that has the interview with Rex in 1974 and a few pictures.
Lyle, do you want to turn off the video? Thank you. Thank you for coming, people.
It's all